Jane entered the house on Sunday evening after the weekend. "Honey, I'm home." There was no answer. She checked the bedroom and bathroom, the backyard and the office. No one. The only light was on in the living room. The rest of the house was in darkness. Returning to the garage, she made sure Dave's car was still there. Strange, she thought. Shrugging her shoulders, she went to make herself something to eat. When Dave still wasn't there by 10 p.m., she called him on his cell phone. There was no answer. Just like Saturday night and this morning, she thought. At midnight, she called the police. They told her they couldn't do anything until the person disappeared for the entire night. Despite her fatigue, she found it difficult to fall asleep. This was all very unlike Dave. The next day, she decided not to go to work, but killed time until 8 in the morning and called the police again. The operator on duty connected her. She said she returned home last night but had not been able to contact her husband since Friday. They promised to send someone within 2 hours. Jane called Dave on his cell phone several more times. Around 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang and Jane let in 2 uniformed policemen. She said everything she thought was relevant. "Madam, there are several common signs that we look for in missing persons cases that give us an idea of whether a person may have disappeared of his own free will or whether it is a crime." They then asked where Dave kept his car, wallet, phone, keys, and passport. Jane pointed to Dave's keys hanging on a hook and led them into the garage to show off his car. They quickly examined it, but did not find anything interesting. Jane then opened the safe to show them Dave's passport, then opened his bedside table. At this point, she started to get really worried. Her husband's wallet was there. Where could he go where he wouldn't need it? The only thing missing was a telephone. Before she could get any more worried, one of the police officers started asking pointed questions. The other stood quite far away, just watching. "Could you tell us about your husband, Mrs. Brown? Where does he work?" "We have our own business, Havelock Industries, you know?" The policeman nodded. "Dave is the CEO, and I help out in the office, doing general administrative duties, helping with books and things like that." "Wow, you must have some money." "Well, yes. Yes, we can afford all the best things in life." "And you say that this is absolutely abnormal behavior for your husband? Has he ever disappeared before?" "No, never. My Dave is a creature of habit. You could set your watch by his daily routine most days." "How would you describe your marriage, Mrs. Brown?" "What are you trying to say? I mean, was your husband happy? Could he have run off with his secretary or something?" Jane laughed briefly. "Well, for starters, I am his secretary. Secondly, Dave would never do anything like that. I am his life. He is completely devoted to me." "Okay, Mrs. Brown. Now, can I ask where you were last weekend?" I went to visit my sister in Colville, left Friday night, and got home just after 7 on Sunday." "Were you driving?" "Yes, it's only 3 hours away." "Okay, Mrs. Brown. That's all I can ask at the moment. Can you give us your husband's cell phone number, all of his bank account numbers, personal and work, and any credit card numbers he uses? Also, please, a list of his friends, his and your family members with their contact details." "Why do you need all the bank account and credit card numbers?" "Well, we know he left his wallet, so if he's somewhere, he needs money to live." "You said there were signs indicating whether he left of his own free will or something bad happened. What does it look like?" "Sorry, Mrs. Brown, but apart from the missing phone, nothing else looks particularly good." It took Jane about 15 minutes to give out all the requested information. Then she walked them to the door. "We will keep you informed. Of course, if it shows up, you'll let us know, won't you?" "Well, of course." The 2 policemen left. As soon as they got into the car, the elder turned to his partner. "Well, it stinks." "What do you mean?" "Didn't you notice how defensive she was when you asked about the state of their marriage? Then she faltered when you asked where she was over the weekend. I'm telling you, John, I think we need to speed up this process. Something is rotten in the Danish kingdom. Is her sister's phone number on the list she gave us? I think it would be a damn good place to start." 2 days later, Dave was still missing. Jane was starting to go crazy with worry. She called the police at least twice a day. But there was no news. On Wednesday morning, The same two police officers showed up at the office as on Monday and asked to speak with her. She took them to Dave's office for some privacy. This time, it was the senior officer who spoke. "Mrs. Brown, you told us on Monday that you spent the entire weekend with your sister in Colville, correct?" "Yes." "Would you like to tell us why you lied, Mrs. Brown?" This startled Jane. It was pure reflex that she stuck to her sister's story last time. She wasn't the type to lie comfortably. Well, it happened like that before, a year ago. Now it has become almost second nature. "I didn't want Dave to find out." "Did you find out what, Mrs. Brown?" "That I wasn't at my sister's." "Where have you been, Mrs. Brown?" "At the Hilton, on the other side of town." "Were you alone?" "No." "Who was with you?" "I don't want to talk." "Well, it's your choice, Mrs. Brown. Either you tell us now, or we will arrest you, take you to the station, and you will tell us—" "What? Arrest me? Why?" "Well, look at it from our point of view, Mrs. Brown. Your husband has disappeared, and all signs point to a crime. There is something else that we will not go into now, but believe me, we have enough reason to detain you. So, your choice. Who were you with at the Hilton all weekend?" "With a man." The policeman who asked the questions smiled triumphantly at his partner. Jane missed the exchange. She was too busy looking at the floor, her face turning red. "With whom exactly, Mrs. Brown?" "With Dennis Smith." "Is this your lover, Mrs. Brown?" "Yes." "Did you leave the hotel at any time between Friday and Sunday?" "No. The only time I left my room was to go to a restaurant to eat." "Can you say the same about Mr. Smith?" "No, he left for about 2 hours on Saturday afternoon. He said that he had some personal matters." "Where can we find this Dennis Smith?" Jane paused before answering. The situation was getting out of control. "Across the hall. He is my husband's deputy." A look of disgust appeared on the policeman's face. "Is it possible, Mrs. Brown, that your husband found out about your infidelity and left you?" "No. We were carefully encrypted. My husband had no way of finding out." "Could you ask Mr. Smith to come here, madam, and then leave us alone?" Without saying a word, Jane stood up and walked into Dennis's office. "Dennis, the police are here. They know about us. They want to talk to you." "Crap!" Dennis's face turned pale. Then he slowly stood up and entered Dave's office with the air of a man going to the gallows. Jane sat in the waiting room for the next 45 minutes, her mind in turmoil with horror. For the first time, she really thought about her affair with Dennis. Until now, she had emotionally separated him, trying not to think. The instigator was bored. Sex with the same man for so many years has become just a routine. Dave stopped asking her for something new and exciting years ago, so it just became uninteresting. When Dennis expressed his desire for a special relationship, Jane had little hesitation. It added the excitement she was missing. Overall, there was very little fault on her part. Except that one time. About 4 months had passed since her infidelity, when Dennis suggested something else she had never tried before. She remembered for a moment how many years ago her husband had suggested the same thing to her, in almost the same words. Of course, she refused him. It was a little too slutty for her taste. She had a vague thought that perhaps she was to blame for the routine nature of sex with Dave. This thought was pushed aside by the excitement of the new experience and was subsequently buried deeply. There was just something else being hidden to enhance her indecent experience. Her secret weekend didn't end well. On Friday night, Dennis suggested that they both file for divorce. Jane immediately rejected his proposal. She wasn't going to leave Dave. On Saturday, Dennis pressed the same button again before the situation escalated. In the heat of the moment, something was said that made Jane suspect that Dennis was trying to get half of the company, so he suggested that she file for divorce. Instinctively, Jane knew better than to tell the police the real reason Dennis disappeared for 2 hours on Saturday night. He rushed out of the room. Yes, he returned. And yes, they made love. But Jane realized that the affair was doomed and began the process of emotionally divorcing her lover. She knew that this had to be done carefully to prevent sudden changes that might alert her husband. After the police left, he and Dennis talked for the rest of the day, discussing all the possible consequences. At 6 in the evening, they parted ways with heavy hearts. Jane, to her suddenly empty house, Dennis, to his wife. Sleep did not suit both of them. The next day at 7 in the morning, Jane was awakened by a loud knock on the door. She opened it and was greeted by a man in a suit, holding a badge in front of his face. Behind him stood 2 uniformed police officers and 2 men in disposable overalls. "Mrs. Brown, I am Detective Danny Bourgeois. We have a search warrant for these premises. We also have a search warrant for your office. We would be grateful if you could provide us with the login information for your and your husband's computers, if you have them." "What, am I a suspect?" "No, we're just looking for clues as to where your husband might be, Mrs. Brown." Stunned, Jane complied with their request, writing the requested passwords on a piece of paper. At his request, she gave him the keys to the office. While the small army that invaded her home was busy, she called Dennis on his cell phone. There was no answer, so she called the landline. Dennis's wife, Andrea, answered. Despite her height of only 1.57 meters, Andrea could pass for a model. She had short, blonde hair cut in a boyish style that hid her round face. Alabaster skin surrounded light blue eyes and full lips. Her C-cup breasts and flawless skin always made Jane jealous. Moreover, this whole package was combined with a truly honest and fiercely loyal personality. She was less likely to cheat on her husband than the Frenchman living next door to the brothel. Not for the first time, Jane wondered why the hell Dennis chose her over his wife. "Jane, do you know why my carpets are being trampled on by 6 policemen?" "No, Andrea. I have the same thing here. It must have something to do with Dave's disappearance." "What? Has Dave disappeared?" Dennis didn't say anything. "What does this have to do with us?" "I don't know, Andrea. Can I talk to Dennis? He's busy with the police now." "Listen, Jane, what's going on?" "I have no idea, Andrea. Sorry, but I have to go. Bye." Returning the phone to its base in the kitchen, Jane saw one of the technicians kneeling on the floor with a strange-looking flashlight. She left the house. In the garage, another technician was sitting in Dave's car. She wanted to get into the car, but the technician stopped her. "We haven't checked her yet, madam." With no way out, Jane sat in her office and listened to relaxing music. The guys in blue left around 2 o'clock in the afternoon without saying a word about her car. Jane drove to the office in Dave's car. Nobody said it wasn't possible. The police left a bit of a mess in the reception area and in Dave and Dennis's office. Dennis was already there, and they exchanged words of consolation. Their recent enmity was forgotten in their shared fear. Jane pushed him away when he tried to hug her, reminding her that they could never show anything in public. They managed to maintain their emotional and physical separation until the weekend. Then, desperate, scared, and alone, Jane called Dennis and they met at their usual hotel for a short fling. She angrily pushed him away when he squeezed her butt, but allowed herself to be hugged in a friendly manner. This whole meeting turned out to be a disaster for Jane. Clearly tormented by guilt and fear, Dennis even began to cry. This opened Jane's eyes. She began to see the veil that covered her consciousness begin to lift. Did she really risk her happy marriage, her sweet, loving husband, for this weakling? An hour later, the decision became clear. Never. And here the feeling of guilt and remorse truly took hold of her. She cried until she fell asleep on Saturday and Sunday evenings and barely slept a wink. Insomnia was caused by 2 things. First, she firmly believed that her husband discovered her infidelity and harmed himself. The second was guilt. Oh yeah, she had it all from the beginning, but she did a brilliant job of burying it deep. Now it has manifested itself with redoubled force. So when Detective Bourgeois woke her up on Monday morning, she was almost unable to think rationally. "Mrs. Brown, would you be willing to accompany me to the police station?" "Yes, sure. I must tell you, Mrs. Brown, that you have the right to legal representation." Jane had already thought about this. She knew deep down that the police weren't done with her yet. No, it's okay, detective. Do I get in your car or can I use my own? Better in mine, madam. The short drive to the station was silent. All this time, Jane wondered if there was bad news. Have they really found Dave? When they arrived at the station, she saw Dennis being led into the building. Danny led her into the interrogation room, where they were joined by a female detective who had not been introduced. As soon as they settled in, the questions began. I just want you to know that this conversation is being recorded. Can you go on record as saying that you agree with this? Yes, I agree with this. Can you also confirm that you did not seek legal advice? Yes, it is true. For the record, Mrs. Brown, we have been monitoring your husband's bank accounts and credit cards for the past week, and there has been absolutely no activity since that Saturday morning when you were gone. What about his mobile phone? I'll get to that. Mrs. Brown, a week ago, 2 of my colleagues visited your home after you reported your husband, David Brown, missing. This is true? Yes, faithfully. During the mentioned visit, they asked you to tell us where you were last Saturday and Sunday. You said you were visiting your sister. Subsequent investigations proved this to be untrue, and you later admitted to spending the weekend at the hotel with Mr. Dennis Smith. Tell me why you lied, Mrs. Brown. With her blatant lies thrown in her face, Jane felt very awkward again. So she answered again after a pause. I didn't want my novel to become public knowledge. Danny turned to the lady sitting to the side of the table. They exchanged nods. Having successfully confused her, Danny continued to question Jane. Mrs. Brown, do you know the passwords to all your husband's accounts? Of course, this is my business too. Did Mr. Dennis Smith also have access to the company's accounts? Yes, sure. He is the chief financial officer. Okay. Are you aware that on the Friday before your trip, a sum of $8.3 million was transferred into Mr. Dennis Smith's personal account, and then immediately transferred to an untraceable account in the Cayman Islands? This amount represents almost the entire working capital of your company. Can you explain your whereabouts on that Friday at 1:17 in the afternoon, Mrs. Brown? Jane suddenly felt her hands giving up. What time did she disappear with Dennis into one of the storage rooms in the backyard? Everything got worse and worse. She realized that both detectives were still waiting for her answer. No, I cannot. Although I was at work. If I receive my diary, I can confirm this. Maybe later, Mrs. Brown. I must say that we suspect that your husband is dead. No, this can't be true. Look at the evidence, Mrs. Brown. Absolutely no action on your husband's accounts. No public appearances. We know he didn't leave the country because his passport is still here. Jane tried to interrupt him, saying that since Dave had dual citizenship, he had 2 passports. But Danny knew his stuff and didn't let her control him. He interrupted her again. You asked about your husband's cell phone earlier, Mrs. Brown. I have to tell you that with the assistance of your husband's service provider, he was found in a dumpster 1 block from your business on Tuesday of last week. A quantity of plastic film was found with him. Both the phone and the tape contained traces of the same type of blood as your husband's. Do you have any comments, Mrs. Brown? Jane turned white as a sheet. If something happened to Dave, she would be devastated. The detectives observed the look of horror on her face and completely misinterpreted it. No. Danny Bourgeois belonged to a new breed of detective, the product of a targeted recruiting policy. Rudely handsome, with a natural ability to calm people down. Modestly intelligent, but with a slightly checkered past. How can I determine this? Let's just say that before he was recruited, he was already known to the police. The combination of intelligence, disarming demeanor, and the insight of a criminal mind ensured his rapid rise through the ranks. With his instinctive approach, he knew the secret was to keep the suspects off balance, so he rushed forward. Then perhaps you could explain where the trace of the large blood stain found on your kitchen floor, which was also confirmed to be your husband's blood type, came from. At this point, all Jane could do was look at the floor and shake her head. After letting it cook for a bit to make things even more confusing, Danny continued to press. For the record, Jane Brown shakes her head. Mrs. Brown, could you comment on the prenuptial agreement found in your safe, which clearly states that in the event of proven infidelity, all property from the marriage between you and David Brown goes to the offended party? For the record, once again, the suspect shakes her head. Are you aware, Mrs. Brown, that during a search of Mr. Dennis Smith's house, a fishing knife was found? Attempts were made to clean it, but traces of human blood were found on it, again of the type that your husband had. Once again, for the record, the suspect shakes her head. And finally, Mrs. Brown, can you explain some of your husband's blood that was found in the trunk of your car? The car you claim was parked at the Hilton Hotel from Friday evening until Sunday evening. According to the examination, this blood was shed sometime on Saturday evening, plus or minus 12 hours. Finally, the gravity of the situation, as well as the deadly certainty, began to dawn on her. A full 5 minutes passed before she responded. Both detectives seemed glad she was taking her time. I think I need a lawyer. No shit, Sherlock. Jane Brown, I'm arresting you for the murder of David Brown. You don't have to say anything, but whatever you say. At this moment, Jane lost consciousness. Jane was detained overnight until 11 the next morning, when the judge set her bail at $250,000 and ordered her to surrender her passport. She was able to access the credit account to transfer money to the business account. She caught a taxi and went home. That night, an absolute shell of a woman who just 8 days ago had been on top of the world pondered the future. The woman who once had everything. She accepted that her husband was dead. What she couldn't bear was the realization that she had caused it. The feeling of guilt and remorse almost stopped her heart. She tried to imagine Dave's face in happier times, but the images of his last breath on her kitchen floor prevented her from doing so. The mental image of his face, wrapped in plastic, looking at her as the trunk closed, ate away at a soul no longer protected by denial. She sat in the kitchen in a daze. The phone rang, and the battered shell automatically answered. It was Dennis. Jane, you have to help me. I called Andrea, and she said she left me and cleared out our bank accounts. You have to help me out, please. Okay, Dennis. She got in touch again and transferred another $250,000 from the credit account. Using her new knowledge, she was able to pay the second deposit. The next day, shortly before lunch, Dennis called again. Thank you, darling. Can I come to your place? I really need to hug you right now. Okay, Dennis. See you soon. As soon as she heard a taxi stop outside, she stood up and headed towards the door. The shell of Jane Brown opened the door. What little sanity she had left was cut short when she saw the monster standing on the porch. You are a lying, murdering bastard! You killed my Dave! Picking up her husband's gun, she pulled the trigger. She didn't see the shock on his face as the monster was thrown back, with a 0.45-inch hole in the center of its chest. He fell so quickly that the second bullet flew over his head. However, the last 6 hit the twitching body lying on the path. With the gun still clutched in the suddenly limp fist, something fell onto the top step, its back to the door frame, and the spirit of Jane Brown was gone. Ruth arrived at her sister's house, mentally preparing herself for the grim task of getting Jane's affairs in order. Noticing that there was mail in the box, she picked it up. Mostly bills, but also one postcard. Following the common logic, if people want to keep the message on card secret, they use an envelope. She took it. The cover was a photo of a beautiful beach in Grand Cayman. On the back, it simply said, "Too bad you and Dennis aren't here. With love, D and A." What does all of this mean? She continued walking into the house. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one. Listening to the next one. Listening to the next one. Listening to